The stage lights were too bright for a 6-year-old. For everyone else they threw a halo. For Annie, they made the silver on her thin chain flash like a small, stubborn star. She walked to the center with the detached calm of a child who had rehearsed the one sentence she needed to say, and nothing more. The auditorium hung on the moment, an awards night for a foundation that carried the Hale name, a carefully arranged evening of speeches and pledges, cameras tucked behind velvet ropes. Jonathan sat in the third row, a presence as much as a person, tall, deliberate, the sort of man whose arrival slightly altered the room's temperature. He had not expected a child to step into the light and tell him the truth. "Dad," she said, clear as a bell and small as a folded paper plane. "It's me. You've been tricked." She held up two things, one familiar, one impossible. The first was a thin, folded sheet of legal paper, edges creased the way someone folds things when they think they must hide them but can't stop handling them. Jonathan's eyes caught the slanted curve of his own signature, the particular way he crossed his T's when anxious. It was a small, human thing that suddenly made the world tilt. The second was a silver chain, delicate, with a tiny charm that swung like a heartbeat. He did not remember buying that exact charm, but memory is a room with many doors, and suddenly one opened. There had been a night years ago, laughter in the air, a hand offered, a promise that sounded like protection. Noise rippled from the crowd, murmurs, the soft, uncertain exhale of people who had come for light and talent, and instead were watching a private wound unfurl on stage. Protocol demanded someone move. Aides should have led the girl away. Security should have swallowed the moment. But security hesitated. Cameras kept rolling. Jonathan remained where he was because his body had not yet decided if it would run or stay. The best decision his staff had learned to make was to buy time. Time, they believed, could be purchased. Time could be smoothed with statements and reassurances. Time was their currency. Annie's voice did not shake. There was a shape of courage there that had not needed to be taught. It had been learned from the necessity of truth. "This is yours," she said, tapping the paper with a small finger. "You signed. My mom says you remember. She says the silence was safer." She paused, and the pause was a small fault line in the auditorium's attention. "But I'm not gone." Jonathan felt something ancient and fragile give way inside him, a denial that had been polished into habit, a careful set of stories, meant to protect reputation and family, that now sounded suddenly thin. He thought of Annette, and that thought was not a headline. It was the smell of a small apartment, the memory of a face he'd once known as close as his own reflection, a half-remembered laugh that used to arrive in the middle of bad news and turn the edge of it soft. He had not thought of that life in the way a child thinks of a backyard over and over, or in the way a lover thinks of mornings. He had thought of it in ledger lines, one payment, sealed, closed. He had believed the ledger balanced. Backstage, someone approached, hands practiced and cautious. Jonathan rose because it was impossible not to, because the body acts while the mind still files evidence. Annie stepped off the stage holding the paper and the necklace like two truths that had been kept for far too long. For her, the theatre lights were only a preface. The rest, what came after, had been lived in quieter rooms. A kitchen with a sink full of dishes, a bedroom with a window that kept the sound of traffic small, nights that felt like negotiations rather than rest. In the private room, where the velvet curtains swallowed light, Jonathan watched her from across a temporary table. He kept his gestures minimal, because he had learned long ago to make every motion mean less, to be efficient in a way that protected others from the messy truth. But there are some facts that carve through efficiency. Up close, the paper was unmistakable. The signature was there, as sure as the tremor of the pen, not forged, not a priest's smudge of authority, but his own script. His name, an instrument he had used to close doors, now opened one. "How long?" he asked, and the question was both clumsy and necessary. It was an adult way of trying to measure suffering. "Since I was little," Annie said. Her voice had that matter-of-fact tone children use when giving an account of a scraped knee. "We kept it safe. My mom told me not to tell people. She said it was better. I wanted to tell you." She smiled in the way children smile when they are telling something they have chosen. It was not triumph, but a clarity that made his chest ache. Somewhere between what he had known and what she said, the shape of his life divided into before and after. He imagined every television moment where men like him practiced remorse, measured, calibrated, delivered on cue. He also imagined what information would cost humanity if he turned away. The choice between silence and truth suddenly felt like a moral lever he had to pull. That night unfolded in concentric rooms. In the immediate hours that followed, aides mobilized, neutral voices, rehearsed questions, a suggestion to make the moment a family matter rather than a public spectacle. The head of his legal team arrived with measured apologies and the language of containment, optics, privacy, protective measures. Jonathan's phone lit with incoming calls, messages flagged urgent. The board would want to know. The press would want a statement. There were, as always, layers of living people affected, donors, partners, employees, programs that depended on a foundation's steady light. Business interests weighed on him like a physical thing. For decades, he had learned to believe that the weight of a single truth could be measured against the losses of many. But memory is not only ledger lines. In the quiet between calls, Jonathan felt memory fill the cracks. A younger him with a different kind of hunger, the night he left a man's meeting early because a woman with a tired face had stood under the rain and asked for a favor. He remembered handing an envelope, a private arrangement meant to keep things safe, and thinking it would be over. He had been convinced that a closed door protected everyone in ways that public truth could not. He had been a protector in his way, protecting his name, his children, the identities he had built for them. He had not realized earlier that protection could also be a way of erasing. Annette did not appear right away. She did not have to. Her presence threaded the room like a tension. Jonathan kept expecting her to arrive with the sort of controlled posture he had seen in other reunions, restrained tears, a composed voice. Instead, what he saw was how quickly his staff defined the event in terms they trusted, a potential scandal to be contained. But the child's hand on that paper refused containment. It asked for verification, not suppression. Verification meant evidence. It meant tests and dates and small objects handled in fluorescent rooms with kind nurses who had seen too many lives reduced to numbers. Jonathan said the word DNA before he fully allowed himself to understand how absolute an action it was. Ordering a DNA test is an admission of possibility. It is to open a doorway that cannot easily be closed. One of his aides called the clinic quietly. No press, private hours. They would move slowly, the clinician promised, with sensitivity and without fanfare. The clinician's tone was precise. Such things take time. The lab would process samples. Results would be delivered through counsel. The caveat was consistent. Legal processes could be unpredictable. Outcomes were not guarantees. That uncertainty had always been Jonathan's most uncomfortable companion. He had spent an adult life trying to tame it. Annie sat in one of those rooms, meant to feel neutral, but always somehow clinical. Soft chairs, a child's drawing taped to the wall, a small bin of plastic animals. She swung her feet and traced the chain around her neck. Annette watched from across the room, hands folded around a small thermos, jaw set as if to hold in 1,000 small fears. Annie's calm was the kind that comes from having practiced courage in private. Annette's face had the marks of someone who had learned to be invisible, by necessity, soothing when needed, fierce beneath the surface. There were stories in the lines around her eyes, nights of bargaining, of small checks deposited and then retracted, of whispered threats that had taught them to speak in code. She had been careful, cunning in her own way, a woman who mapped safety by subtraction. The nurse took samples with the tenderness that belonged to people who do human work, the soft explanation of the procedure, the quick, deft motion that made a child laugh at discomfort. Annie told a small joke about the sticker the nurse offered her, and the laugh bent the room toward a normal no one wanted to assume. When the envelope left the clinic, the air felt denser. The tests were a promise of clarity. They were also an indictment of avoidance. Jonathan thought about the paper again, about the signature. It had not been a document drawn in malice, he told himself. At least, that was how he had explained it for years. It had been a contract drawn out of fear, a formalization of decisions that felt better when labeled legal. Annette had accepted its terms. She had chosen a route he had not imagined would last this long. That choice meant survival. It meant quiet at the cost of being seen. The idea that such an arrangement could erase a child from a man's life sat with a weight that made the bones of his chest ache. Outside the clinic, the city moved at its usual indifferent pace. The sun angled through glass facades, the hum of tires on asphalt, a bus full of commuting strangers. The world's normalcy was an acute affront to the seismic shift of one family's past, catching up with a public present. For the people who lived by headlines, the story might become a momentary glare of interest, then fade. For those who had to sleep with the memory every night, for Annie and Annette, it was a lifetime of small decisions stitched together. Back in the hail car that moved with a driver's quiet efficiency, Jonathan tried to thread the night's fragments into something like a plan. The legal team had suggestions: secure the child, establish counsel, conduct tests in private. They emphasized process. How to mitigate, how to frame, how to prepare the foundation for inevitable questions. The board, when informed, would prefer a narrative that minimized damage, present a clear, firm line between the private and the public, reassure stakeholders that systems were intact. In that proper corporate tone, systems meant initiatives, endowments, futures. Jonathan understood the calculus. He understood the urge to protect the institution he had built. It wasn't a vain love. It was a final attempt to keep a network of people from feeling the tremor of one man's fault. But the child's paper weighed differently. It required not damage control, but redress. It required presence. The thought of a press release that smoothed his conscience into acceptability repulsed him in a way he had not expected. He could imagine 1,000 statements written by 1,000 people that would sound fine in the abstract, but would fail the small test of being true when Annie looked up at him in the dark and asked why he had not come sooner. He called Annette that night with the familiarity reserved for a voice you had loved once and still owed. It was a number he had kept in a file labeled everything practical and nothing sentimental. She answered after the third ring, measured, as if she had rehearsed 1,000 ways to speak without offering herself up to hurt. They did not speak like lovers. They spoke like two people bearing the weight of a thing that had always been private, but had now stepped into a light neither wanted. "Why now?" he asked, not wanting to sound like a man making excuses, but aware of how much of his life had been made under the illusion of choices that had been practical at the time. Annette's voice softened in a way that suggested more she wanted to be steady than she wanted to be kind. "She wanted you to know you were tricked," she said. "We kept the paper safe. We kept the necklace for a long time," she asked. "She wanted you to know." There was a pause, where the silence tasted like all the things avoided over years. Questions of responsibility, the ethics of money meant to heal, the small cruelty of favors that become permanent. He heard, too, the subtext of a life run on caution, The neighbour who had never asked questions, the landlord who had turned a blind eye when rent was delayed, the nights when staying invisible felt safer than a confrontation. Annette had kept them moving by the smallest of miracles. A hand of cash here, a refusal there, the negotiation of survival that never made the news. He had assumed, self-protectively, that those days were over because he had made them so. But making something so by erasure was not the same as fixing it. They agreed to test, and neither of them used the word court. They both understood, perhaps in different ways, how complicated legal entanglements could become and how media could turn personal pain into headlines. Annette was firm about Annie's safety. She did not want a spectacle. She had learned the cost of visibility. She wanted first to know and then to plan. Jonathan promised he would not make calls he could not explain, that he would not use his own team to shape their narrative. It was a kind of oath that was less dramatic than it sounds. It was the place between grand gestures and practical ethics. When the results were returned, Jonathan sat on the edge of his bed in a hotel room that had been paid for out of the budget assigned to contingency. The city lights leaned in through the curtains. The unbelieving part of him kept hoping labs made mistakes. The more reasonable part of him had a hum of dread that he had felt before, in business decisions where risk had been inevitable and the moral ledger unforgiving. The confirmation came in a polite note from counsel. It matched. It was not a long document. It was a sentence that carried with it a rearrangement of a life. The DNA results were clear, the sort of scientific language that refused poetic ambiguity. Jonathan read the words twice, slowly, feeling each syllable land like a pebble in a pond. There was a small, private sound, his breath catching, then a long exhale that reorganized the architecture of his chest. The team waited for his next move. The standard options lay bare, like instruments on a tray. He could call a private meeting and begin a slow strategy of containment. He could pay for silence and attempt to buy both privacy and his own quiet conscience. He could publish a statement and calibrate it to minimize damage. That was the playbook, the trained reflex of a man who had built a career on control. But the paper, the necklace, the child's voice, they reframed the calculus. He chose not to hide. There is a particular humility in choosing transparency when all your life you have built systems to avoid it. It is less spectacular than scandal, less thrilling than confession on a grand stage, but it is profoundly harder. The willingness to accept immediate loss in service of long-term repair. He called his head of legal and told them he would not take the path of containment. The request was small, radical in its quiet. Arrange for an independent counsel for Annette and Annie. No foundation PR, no staged reunions, no buy-offs. There was a silence on the phone long enough for the other end to register that he was serious. The head of legal, who had learned crisis management like a trade, tried the familiar language first. Optics, donor confidence, the harm to programs. Jonathan listened. He had spent decades listening to words that preserved schedules. Then he said simply, "They're people." The conversation shifted. Counsel's tone became less surgical, more human. They advised procedures, protective measures for Annie, private counsel, an insistence on allowing Annette to lead decisions about publicity. They made clear that this choice would carry costs, reputational damage, board unrest, potential lawsuits. But it was counsel consistent in its honesty. There would be no safe shortcuts. The path to accountability would be procedural, slow, and public in parts. If he was ready for consequence, they would help him meet it. If not, they would strategize in the old way. He would have to choose. His choice threw a ripple outward the way a stone does. A junior aide leaked a truncated version of the night to a reporter, rumors of an unexpected moment at the Foundation's gala, a girl and a paper, but the leak was blunt and small, a minor ripple in the current. Jonathan's decision to refuse containment dissolved the simple arithmetic of cover and calm. It pushed the situation into a more honest and therefore more volatile place. The press could cover it, yes, but it could not manufacture the full story. It required patience. That afternoon, Annie went back to school. She walked a little taller, as if truth had been a secret she had kept and was glad to share. Her classroom smelled of crayons and damp paint. Her teacher asked nothing about the stage. Children often know how to hold adult stories at a safe distance. At home, Annette folded laundry and watched a documentary on a small screen with the kind of attention that keeps one safe and informed without allowing panic to take root. They moved through ordinary tasks, like people learning to balance a large weight, with method, with attention to the smallest gestures that mean care. Jonathan returned to a house with rooms that still smelled faintly of the people who lived there, his partner's perfume in a half-empty bottle on the dresser, the soft clink of cutlery in the kitchen, where servants had set out coffee and a plate of toast that no one would eat. He opened a drawer and found old things, a card from years ago, a photograph of him and his children on a beach, a men's watch he had not worn in months. Objects have a terrible honesty. They do not strategize or lie. They remind you of the life you have made and the small omissions you had allowed. He thought of the paper again, and how easy it had been to let an agreement stand. Agreements are often believed to be neutral. They are not. They are made by people with unequal power, and they carry with them the weight of survival decisions. He had been a man with the means to make problems go away, and in doing so, he had not always measured what gets erased when a problem is pushed out of sight. His life had many people who depended on the Foundation's good name, but there were also people who had been quietly affected by his absent presence. As the evening drew on, he wrote a note to himself he did not intend to send to anyone. Presence over protection. The phrase surprised him by its simplicity. He had never been a man of many slogans, but he had believed in the utility of being present in the ways that matter. Signed checks, foundations, named programs. He did not yet know what presence would feel like in the new sense, being at school pickups, hearing bedtime stories, the small humiliations and sudden joys of fatherhood after a long absence. The idea felt heavy and also clean, like an honest thing that had been finally named. The wind that night tugged at the curtains in his bedroom. He imagined what the next days would demand. Press statements shaped by candor, legal processes that required patience, a careful choreography if the family was to meet. He imagined Annette and Annie with their own lives and histories, which would now intersect with his more publicly than he wanted. He thought of lawyers telling him that truth is an inexorable thing. Once set in motion, it has its own momentum. He thought of the child's small hand on the paper and the way time had made that fold permanent. Before he slept, he walked to the window and looked out across the city, pools of light and anonymous movement, and thought of how many things in life are decided in rooms like the one he had held that night. He thought of the ways power can make silence feel safe, and of the ways silence can be a form of harm. He no longer knew which of his old narratives would hold, if any. He had a daughter who claimed him. He had a woman who had been making choices in a world that had not always been kind. And somewhere in the city, a laboratory technician prepared a small sample and entered numbers into a system. People who had nothing to do with the Hale name lived their own days, cafeterias, subway rides, retail counters, and the news would soon take shape. For now, though, the world held its breath in a domestic way. A kettle whistled, a child dropped her crayon, someone else closed a door with too much force. Jonathan breathed, too, feeling the weight of choices settle into the fibers of his life. If this story matters to you, if the question of truth against power feels like something you want others to consider, please like or share this moment so more people see how brave small voices can be. The next morning began with paper again. There were emails to friends, a call from a board member who wanted assurances, and a gentle, firm message from Annette asking for patience and safety for Annie. Jonathan arranged for an independent attorney to meet with them. He asked questions he had never asked before. What did they need? What kept them safe? How had they sustained themselves? The answers were not dramatic. They were practical and fierce. Money at the right time, a neighbor who never asked too many questions, a job that paid enough, a silence kept intact by fear of reprisal, a belief that visibility would bring more harm than good. Because he had always been quick to control outcomes, the lack of immediate control unnerved him. He learned from Annette's steady voice how much of life is cursory, small bravery. Cooking on pay-as-you-go stoves, smoothing a child's hair through nights when the world felt hazardous, feigning the confidence you do not feel so the people you love feel safer. He felt shame at the ways his choices had been small comforts that cost others a great deal. It was the worst kind of accounting. Numbers could capture donations, but they could not capture nights spent inventing stories to keep a child safe. There were quiet scenes, too, that were as important as the loud ones. Annie colouring in lines, choosing crayons with a fierce deliberateness, Annette tearing open a cheap envelope to find a cheque that paid a utility bill, a neighbour bringing a casserole because they had once slept in a child's crisis and now wanted to repay a debt of small compassion. These were the textures of their lives, the ways survival had been managed quietly, with the economy of care that only those who must be invisible can practice. Jonathan remembered a specific night 6 years earlier. A small restaurant, rain on the pavement, Annette's coat damp at the hem, a single plate between them. He had offered what he thought would be a solution, a small cheque, some assurances. He had promised discretion, a kind of moral smoothing that in his mind protected everyone's dignity. He had asked for calm, for distance. He had thought that was the charitable thing to do. He had convinced himself that charity was the answer. Now he saw the other side, a life negotiated by fear, where the cost of making a stand had been unbearable. The paper she held had been called a document of settlement. For Annette, it had been a bargain negotiated at a time when her choices were narrow. The bargain had never been written in malice. It had been a survival pact. But survival at the cost of presence is not resolution. His legal counsel briefed him on the next steps. There would be depositions, there would be a mediation offer, there would be reporters who smelled conflict like blood in water. The counsel also advised patience that was specific and dull. Private hearings, privilege, negotiation strategies. The law, as counsel described it, would not give the quick absolution he might want. It would move like molasses, slow and sticky. There would be times when he would be frustrated by process, and times when the process would be the only thing that provided a workable path forward. Jonathan accepted the counsel's outline and asked one self-directed question that had nothing to do with legal strategy. How do you become a father after absence? The question had no easy answer. He imagined small rituals as a starting point. Being at Annie's school for a performance without cameras, learning the name of her favorite cereal, repairing a necklace clasp. He imagined the hum of ordinary presence, the weight of a hand in his, that cannot be scheduled by publicists. He found himself at the foundation office the next day, walking through corridors that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper. A junior assistant asked if he would approve a statement. He declined. He wanted to speak, yes, but he wanted to speak in a voice that would not flatten what Annie and Annette needed it to be. He insisted on independence for their counsel, a move that unsettled the board but was, in his assessment, ethically non-negotiable. News outlets began to murmur by midday. The leak had worked its way into an ecosystem that turned private fissures into collective currency. Headlines were small and speculative at first. "Family moment at gala," read one. Social media populated the evening with 1,000 versions. Some cruel, some curious, some compassionate. Annie was not featured in photos. The staff refused any visual exploitation and described only her hands, the necklace, the paper. There was a deliberate protection in the frames selected. No face shots, no child in the center of angry arguments. The institution had lines it would not cross. Jonathan had insisted on that. By evening, Jonathan asked to meet Annette in a neutral place, an old diner with a vinyl counter and cracked tiles, a place where the world felt ordinary and therefore safe. He arrived before her, the smell of coffee and frying oil settling over his coat. He watched the door because he had learned that people carry histories with how they enter rooms. When Annette came in, she wore no dramatics, a worn jacket, a braid kept discreetly to one side, the kind of look that says practicality first. Annie sat beside her with a comic book, eyes flicking up to smile at him like someone practicing a new habit. They did not converse at first. They ate grilled cheese sandwiches that glowed in the fluorescent light, the most ordinary of meals, ridiculously perfect for small reconciliations. The sandwich felt like a ritual, an offering of real sustenance. Annie giggled at the way cheese stretched with each bite, a sound that unstitched something in Jonathan's sternum he did not know had been sewn there. The conversation was halting, made of small, practical things. Annette spoke plainly about safety plans, about how press access would be managed, about how they had to think of school and stability before any grand gesture. She asked for a period of independent counsel and for time to think before any public reunion. Jonathan listened. He took in details, like the way Annette's hands smoothed the napkin, or how Annie insisted on sharing fries even when Jonathan declined. He learned small economies of grace, acceptances, apologies, a willingness to meet in ordinary places. He realized in a way he had not earlier that accountability would demand more than a single statement. It would demand time and the willingness to be present when presence was humbling. The diner hummed with the ordinary energy of people living lives not aligned to headlines. A waitress refilled his coffee with the kind of practiced cheerfulness that made him briefly consider what anonymity had cost him. He thought about the archives of small kindnesses he had missed. A school play, a scraped knee, a lullaby he had never learned to sing. The weight of those omissions pressed like a sum in the quiet ledger of his memory. They left the diner with a plan to proceed carefully. Annette agreed to an independent counsel. Jonathan agreed to provide resources, but no public statements without mutual consent. They stood on the steps outside, Annie holding Jonathan's hand in a grip both confident and tentative, as if rehearsing a future that might be tender. Jonathan felt the small, precise stitches of a life beginning to be mended, not by spectacle, but by what might be called an ordinary courage. The courage to show up when the world expected you to stay away. Later that night, in a hotel that felt like an anonymous node between his life and a new kind of responsibility, he opened a drawer and found an old photograph of him and Annette, younger and unguarded. The picture showed two people who had not yet been conquerors of fear and who thought their choices could remain private without consequence. He thought of the paper she had pressed into his palm minutes ago and of the child who had the audacity to name him in public. The necklace on the child's chest had been a small, stubborn sign that some things cannot be purchased into oblivion. The days that followed layered themselves into a slow documentary of small, steady work. Jonathan sat with counsel and learned how to be accountable in procedural ways. Annette met with her lawyer and asserted the small, crucial needs of a mother who had been balancing survival. Annie went to school and practiced the unremarkable bravery of being a child who had just told the truth. The world continued to make itself in the usual indifferent manner. Deliveries, meetings, the dull turnover of appointments. But for three people who had been orbiting each other from a distance, the axis of their lives shifted. And yet, the future was not a tidy destination. There were darker, complicated things in the margins. The board sent an emissary who asked for stability. The press smelled a drama and prepared commentaries. There were whispers, some of them ugly, about motives and timing. Jonathan received legal letters that contained threats thinly veiled in corporate language. Every move drew consequences, and every action had a counterbalance in the system that sustained him. He understood finally that accountability would not be a public spectacle or a private absolution. It would be a grind, a prolonged work of repair. That thought made him sleep uneasily, but with a kind of determination he had not experienced before, a willingness to accept the long, modest labor of being present. In a drawer in Annette's kitchen, a small envelope lay with the neatness of a life preserved. Receipts, a note with a phone number he had never used, a tiny map of safe transit routes. The envelope was not dramatic. It was ordinary and therefore sacred. It testified to a life built on practical caution. It held the evidence of what sometimes counts for the most, quiet preparations and the knowledge of how to hide a child from a world that might not be kind. The narrative had begun reluctantly to reweave itself. Jonathan had no illusions. He could not, in a single grand gesture, redeem the time lost. He could, however, attempt to be present. He could attempt to make right what he had not understood to be wrong. He walked through these days with a new vocabulary, one made less of corporate euphemisms and more of small human verbs. Sit, listen, be here. One morning, months after the initial reveal, a small parcel arrived at Annette's door, a repaired clasp for the silver necklace, polished and simple, with a short note. No grand rhetoric, no public pronouncements, just a line that read, "I will be here." The note was private. It was imperfect and still raw, but it was present. They met that afternoon at a small park near a line of trees that kept the city noise distant. The air smelled of earth and newness. Annie ran ahead with a scraped knee and the kind of attention only a child has for the particularities of a stick or a shell. Annette watched, and Jonathan watched her watch, and in watching the watching he began to learn the slow grammar of responsibility. Patience, the acceptance of small harms, and the daily decisions that say, incontestably, "I will not let this be undone again." He had chosen transparency. He had chosen to allow truth to be aired in public. That did not mean the public would be kind, nor that the legal world would be forgiving. It meant that he had decided to trade the armor of silence for the discomfort of accountability. The shape of the work ahead was not yet clear, but the first step had been taken. The child had been seen. The paper had been unfolded. The necklace had been recognized. Presence, he realized, is a hard thing to earn, but a simple thing to offer. And in that small park, under a late afternoon sun, the three of them, father, mother, daughter, walked along a path that did not promise sudden fixings or swift endpoints. It promised instead a series of small acts that accumulate into a life. The rest of the story would unfold in rooms of deposition and counsel, in nights of awkward intimacy, in moments of quiet repair that no press would cover. For now, the movement was gentle and definitive. They had found each other where it had once hurt to be found. They began by making the small, steady choices that felt like scaffolding for a life. Legal calendars filled with dates that insisted on patience. Custody and civil hearing schedules threaded the months with long procedural waits. Jonathan learned, often in the small hours, that time stretched differently when you had decided to answer for something. He spent nights making lists in a notebook he kept by the bed, practical items, independent counsel retained for Annette and Annie, a separate escrow to pay immediate needs, a request that no cameras be allowed near the child, a pledge to step back from public duties until the family's privacy and safety could be assured. Each item on the page felt like a tiny promise he could, at least in theory, honor. The Foundation's board reacted along a predictable arc. Some members, loyal for years, were visibly shaken but sought compromise. Others measured risk in spreadsheets and donor projections. A few argued quietly and stiffly for a containment strategy. Legal settlements, non-disparagement clauses, a controlled release that would settle questions and leave programs intact. Jonathan refused. That refusal was costly in ways that were not always dramatic. A scheduled gala was cancelled. A major donor asked for clarification about the Foundation's governance. A board meeting that had once been routine became a referendum on leadership. Jonathan sat through long rooms of people who had known him in headlines and balance sheets and listened as they catalogued worst-case scenarios. He did not indulge the language of damage control. He spoke instead in unadorned sentences. We owe these people honesty. We will make good on practical needs. We will not trade privacy for silence. He agreed to take a temporary leave from executive duties until the family matters were clarified. The decision was both symbolic and practical. It removed the immediate accusation of influence over processes that would affect Annette and Annie, and it signaled a public acceptance of responsibility. Some board members accepted this as necessary. Others accepted it with obvious reluctance. The move did not save him reputation, but reputation was not what he now equated with value. The press circled like weather. Early bursts of speculation gave way to a more sustained curiosity that the foundations of power find irresistible. Why had a child been kept away? Pieces ran that tried to turn private decisions into moral spectacles, drawing neat lines between wealth and avoidance. Social feeds weighed in with hot takes, some vicious, some sympathetic. The outlets that prided themselves on restraint published photos of the gala's exterior, images of curtains and marble and the hands of attendees. Reporters respected Jonathan's request to avoid showing Annie. Staff instructed that any public images be limited to small details if necessary: a hand on a paper, a necklace clasp, a folded legal page, never a child's face. That deliberate framing limited freakish curiosity and left room for the story to be told with dignity. Annette and her counsel moved through the mechanics of legal redress, depositions, witness statements, documentary evidence. They compiled years of receipts, bank statements, and the envelope of careful objects that mapped a life lived in the margins. Annette's testimony would not be the sort that made for swift, viral drama. It was steadier, made of lists and memories, of nights counted in bus rides, and of the small escalations of worry that become a life's weather. Her recollections were precise in the ways that matter. Dates when an agreed check arrived and was then rescinded, a neighbor who offered a place to sleep when rent was late, the careful steps she had taken to keep Annie invisible when threats had been made. She did not rehearse victimhood, she narrated survival. Preparing for the depositions, Jonathan rehearsed nothing. He hired a counselor to help him speak with honesty. He sat for hours in a small room with a legal coach who taught him how to say difficult things plainly. Acknowledge, accept, do not pivot into platitudes. He practiced listening, an unfamiliar task he realized required its own muscle. Often, when he rehearsed answers, he found himself returning to the same fragment of memory, the night he had handed an envelope across a rain-slick table, insisting that discretion might be kindness. What he had not measured then was how discretion could calcify into erasure. The discovery of that truth was a kind of grief that was not sonorous. It was a quiet flattening, a recognition that some comforts were cheap at another person's cost. The depositions themselves moved slowly, with the particular slowness of institutional things. A civil litigation room smelled of coffee and paper. Lawyers circulated plastic water bottles, legal pads filled with neat ink. The court reporter's machine clicked like a metronome. Annette's deposition came first. She spoke with a steadiness that surprised even those who had known her. Her voice did not break into theatrics. Instead, she delivered a chronology, how the agreement had been negotiated at a time when options were limited, what assurances she had been promised, the instances when she had been threatened with consequences for visibility. She described the necklace, a thin chain with a small charm, polished until it gleamed, not because anyone had meant it to be precious, but because it had been an anchor in a life of small instants of hope. She described how, over years, her choices had become a series of tiny safeties: avoidance, careful routes home, a neighbor who never asked too many questions. Her eye contact was measured. When she spoke of Annie, the color left her face and then returned, as if her body was carefully calibrating the pain. The defense mounted its questions along predictable lines. Counsel asked about timing, about motive. They tried to suggest choices that might have been pragmatic rather than coerced, seeking ambiguity. Annette answered plainly, yes, choices were sometimes pragmatic. Yes, she had signed documents. Yes, the fear of escalation led her to keep the child hidden for stability. The legal language brushed against the human language, and, as often happens, the human language cut more cleanly. There were pauses where the room seemed to wait for louder drama, but the quieter testimony held more power. The small details that demonstrated a pattern: intermittent payments, the careful keeping of receipts, the nights when she had packed a suitcase because a call had suggested danger. Jonathan's own testimony, when it came, was not a show. He did not seek absolution through spectacle. He sat at a long table, his hands folded, a taxicab of nerves that made his legs feel like they belonged to someone else. He was asked, in formal tones, about the signing of the document. He told the truth that was his to tell, that he had signed a settlement with assurances that at the time seemed like an answer to something messy, that he had not understood the full consequence of paperwork, that he had believed secrecy could be a shield without recognizing it could be erasure. He spoke about how, when you are a man surrounded by people who curate your life, you can make decisions that feel practical because you are insulated from the small daily costs. He admitted again and again to absence, not just physical absence, but the absence of presence. Cross-examination attempted to turn honesty into liability. The tactics were clinical, designed to poke at the seams. A hostile attorney asked sharp questions about the timing of donations, about bank entries, about a request made in a marginal note on a calendar. Jonathan answered with the gravity he had achieved. At one point, the room exhaled for him when he refused to defend a system built on secrecy. He said plainly, "I should have done more." And those words, unadorned, landed in the quiet room like a small, undeniable fact. They could not undo years, but they acknowledged them. All the while, someone watched Annie's routines. Annette's counsel insisted on safeguards, no drop zones near school that would be identifiable, photo releases to be signed only when the child could consent in a meaningful way, no press at any family event until both parents agreed. The child's privacy was protected by legal and moral decisions that felt to them like mutual vows. The press learned, after effort and careful reminders, to frame coverage without intrusion. Most of the public commentary, forced by the limits imposed, focused on Jonathan's choices, the institution's governance, and the legal struggle. The child's life unfolded in private margins, playdates in small parks, a science fair where Annie brought glue and pom-poms, evenings when Jonathan learned to fold laundry without making it a show. There were corrosive attempts to make the situation into a currency. Anonymous threats arrived, garish letters meant to intimidate, and crude social media accounts posted supposition and rumor. An assistant intercepted a particularly spiteful tweet and felt in the stomach the old reflexes of power, to retaliate, to silence. Jonathan forbade it. He had made a choice that accountability meant letting things play out and accepting consequences without counter-assaults. That meant allowing the press to ask questions without warring against every hostile voice. He chose instead to let the truth be sifted in public and legal arenas. The courtroom was not a gladiatorial arena where all wounds were healed in dramatic flourish. It was a chamber where the law required measured proof and human testimony. Witnesses included an administrative officer who had once handled a payment, a neighbor who confirmed Annette's patterns of moving quietly, and a therapist who had seen the family in a private capacity and could speak to the effects of erasure on a child's sense of self. Each witness added a brushstroke to the painting being assembled. It was not merely about money or strategy, it was about how the apparatus of protection had functioned as a way of not seeing. At one point, an exhibit was entered into record. The folded paper Annie had held on stage, archived with custodial notations. The court clerk displayed a thin silver necklace in a sealed envelope, small, ordinary, impossibly resonant. The necklace had been repaired months before and sent back with a note. "I will be here." That simple sentence, placed into record, seemed to carry with it everything they were negotiating for. Presence, not purchase. Relationship, not avoidance. When Jonathan was asked to sit on the stand and answer under oath whether he had intended to erase a child's life or to protect it, silence held for a moment. He said the truth as plainly as he could. He had not intended malice. He had intended an arrangement that he believed then would prevent harm. He had been wrong. Those words were not absolution. They were a realistic admission that would form part of the court's calculus. Judge and counsel deliberated in rooms that smelled of wood and dry air. When the ruling was handed down weeks later, it was written with long sentences that skated between law and human consequence. The judge ruled the earlier agreement voidable on grounds that the circumstances under which it had been signed involved coercion, and that a child's right to known parentage could not be dismissed by a private document. The court ordered a restoration of parental rights, with a detailed custody plan to be determined after a structured period of review and support services. A mediator was appointed to help the adults coordinate practical care for Annie, and the court mandated confidentiality around the child's schooling and location. The ruling was careful and deliberate, legal in form, human in intent. It neither erased the past nor granted miracle. It offered a way forward rooted in oversight and structure. For Jonathan, the ruling was quieter than a triumph and heavier than a relief. It demanded that he meet the months ahead with patient labor. Custody arrangements required him to be present not for press photographs, but for school pickups. The humdrum tasks of parenting others teach you, and the ones that teach you humility. He enrolled in parenting classes the court recommended, not because he needed certificates, but because the lessons on routine, attunement, and consistent availability felt like a curriculum in becoming a father. Annette negotiated a pace that felt safe for her child. She chose to maintain primary physical custody initially, with structured visits for Jonathan that could grow as Annie adjusted. It was a balance that honored her need to protect and Jonathan's need to make amends with presence, not statements. Their lawyers drafted agreements that preserved Annette's agency. Only she could agree to expanded public visibility. Only she could decide when joint events would be safe. There was power in that constraint. It placed decision-making back into a life that had been negotiated away. Daily life, as it always does, settled into repetition. Jonathan learned to measure time in sandwich making, the exact moment to flip bread so cheese would stretch without burning, the patience to let the pan sit, and the humility to accept when it was too hot. He learned the correct temperature for bathwater a child liked, the name of Annie's favorite cartoon character, how to tie shoelaces in a way a 6-year-old could easily undo but feel proud of. He sat on the kitchen floor, helping with puzzles that refused to be solved on the first try. He learned to entertain without showing off, to be useful without demanding credit. These tasks, absurdly small, were where the real work happened. Neighbors watched the family's slow integration with something like guarded curiosity and, in many cases, quiet warmth. They brought casseroles on bad weeks and cake on birthdays. A teacher wrote a note about Annie's progress and tucked it in a folder that Jonathan treasured more than any public accolade. In the evenings, he composed messages to himself, notes that were more reminders than epistles. Be on time, listen, don't be performative, accept the quiet. He kept them in the same bedside notebook that had once catalogued legal pledges. Practical, incremental, human. There were setbacks. A hostile op-ed argued the court had been too lenient. An anonymous source alleged motives that were unkind. A board member quietly resigned, citing distraction and governance concerns. Money managers argued for the bottom line. Those were the days when Jonathan felt the old reflex to retreat into systems and spreadsheets. He resisted. He answered phone calls, frankly, sometimes simply saying he could not comment on legal matters. He prioritized the requests coming from Annette: supply vouchers, help with a leaky sink, a review of school options. He hired someone to repair the clasp of the silver necklace once again, and when the small parcel arrived, he sat at Annette's kitchen table and threaded the chain with a careful thumb and forefinger, the way someone attends to a tender thing. As months edged into a year, the small repairs accumulated. Jonathan was present at a school recital, but stood to the side with a book, not a camera, and applauded wildly when Annie sang a note. He learned to read a book out loud slowly so a child could follow, and asked questions. What colors did she like? Which friend did she prefer to sit with, that he had not known how to ask before? Annette negotiated new trust in increments, and at each small step she felt agency return. She decided the first televised interview would happen 6 months in, on terms she approved. She was careful to ensure Annie had a voice in the matter appropriate to her age. That voice, when it emerged, spoke about liking monkeys and the way Dad made pancakes. It did not offer moralizing statements. It offered a child's simple truth. The foundation changed, too. In board meetings that lasted late into the night, governance reforms were proposed, clearer conflict of interest policies, independent review committees, new channels to protect beneficiaries when power imbalances might otherwise silence them. Some changes were performative, some were substantive. Jonathan supported both, insisting on accountability beyond public statements. He agreed to transparency measures about the Foundation's disbursements and to an independent audit that would answer questions donors had raised. He did not do it to placate critics. He did it because the work required institutional change in order to ensure similar harms would not recur. There were moments of tenderness that had nothing to do with law. One rainless afternoon, a small craft project transformed Jonathan's living room into a constellation of glue and glitter. He sat on the floor between a scattering of paper cutouts and watched Annie glue stars to a sheet with fierce concentration. She looked up and told him simply that she wanted a story about a girl who found a secret door in a library. He made up an ending, clumsy and warm, and she laughed at the parts that were silly. Those evenings, unremarkable, ordinary, felt to him like lanterns that illuminated the path he had chosen. Annette, too, found places of quiet restoration. She took a job that allowed flexible hours. She accepted the support Jonathan offered for childcare and housing repairs without seeing it as a payment for silence, but as a resource to stabilize a life. She resumed friendships that had been tentative during years of concealment. She attended, with Jonathan, some family therapy sessions that had a tone of work rather than blame. They learned how to speak about boundaries and to make requests of one another without rehearsed defensiveness. There were rituals the three of them created that replaced secrecy with predictability. Saturday mornings became pancake mornings for a while, then family art afternoons, then a quiet walk around a small lake where Annie collected smooth stones, and Jonathan learned to carry a small backpack with a thermos and napkins. One evening, when the city was a hush of warm light, Annette asked Jonathan to fix the clasp of the necklace in front of Annie. He did so with hands that trembled slightly. He fastened it around her neck and did not make a show of it. He simply threaded the chain and smiled. Annie beamed a private, immediate smile that lit her face. The necklace, once a symbol of secrecy, became a small sign of mending. Months later, a public statement was arranged at Annette's direction. It was short and deliberately not sensational. She spoke about the difficulties they had endured and about the courage of a child who chose truth, and she thanked the people who had respected their privacy. Jonathan spoke after her, not to dominate the moment, but to acknowledge hurt and the need for accountability. He refused to speak in corporate phrases. He said simply that he had a responsibility to be present, and that he intended to live into that responsibility. The statement did not close wounds. It honored them. The court's oversight softened over time into a structured co-parenting plan. The judge's orders included regular check-ins and a provision that both parents work with a child specialist to shape visits in ways that maintained emotional safety. Annette retained control over school decisions for the early months. Jonathan committed to evening and weekend time. Each court-mandated session was less about legal dominance than practical scaffolding, how to create predictable rhythms that allowed a child to know what would happen next. The work of parenting, the court seemed to acknowledge in its bureaucratic way, is made of small, consistent acts that must be carried out over a long stretch. The legal battles, the boardroom tension, the reputation questions, they remained as threads in the broader tapestry, not as its center. Jonathan's public life contracted for a season. He gave up a few honorific roles he had held for years, partly to relieve the foundation of the appearance of conflict, and partly because his priorities had shifted. He did not view this as martyrdom. He saw it as trade, a strategic retreat from certain platforms in exchange for the daily, hard labor of presence. He wrote letters sometimes, one he kept in a drawer, pages where he described the small joys of a day with Annie, the way she pronounced certain words, the way she refused identical socks, the way she could build a tower of blocks and then declare it art. He wrote not to win anyone's sympathy, but to train his mind to record ordinary moments as valuable. Those pages, later compiled into a small-bound notebook, felt to him like the truest archive of what he had learned, that parenthood is not a public performance, but a domestic devotion. Not all relationships were repaired. Some friends withdrew, a few relatives' voices hardened into judgment. Those fractures were neither surprising nor necessarily unjust. Annette's trust had to be rebuilt, and not everyone would make that journey. Jonathan accepted some losses as inevitable. He tried not to let bitterness creep into the process. He practiced humility the way one might practice a difficult instrument, regularly, awkwardly, patiently. At night, he sometimes walked the city on errands, buying a particular cereal Annie liked, waiting for a repairman to arrive, collecting a small bouquet for Annette's kitchen table. On these walks, he observed ordinary people, an older couple arguing softly about a train schedule, a teenager practicing skateboard moves, a barista who always wrote his name neatly. Those small human scenes grounded him. They reminded him that his life, once a tower of abstraction and strategy, now required the concrete work of being known. The final legal resolution did not come with fanfare. In a quiet hearing, with both parties present and with mediation complete, the court entered an order that formalized the custody arrangement they had been living into. A primary custody designation, structured visitations, shared decision-making on long-term education, and a mechanism for revisiting the schedule as Annie grew. The prior agreement was formally set aside. The legal language was dense and careful, but the effect felt to those who had lived the months before it like a clearing, a formal permission to move on, and a public record that the erasure had been undone. It did not heal everything, but it acknowledged wrongs and set a course for repair. When the papers were finalized, there was no parade. They returned to the small park with an old tree and a bench that smelled of pine. Annie ran ahead to a swing and Jonathan pushed gently, learning how much to push and when to stop. Annette sat on the bench, a sparkling bottle of olive oil she needed for dinner beside her, and they spoke in the language of ordinary coordination. Pick-up times, winter boots, who called the pediatrician. The mundane felt like holy ground now, the place where real life would be rebuilt. On the day school started after the formal decision, Jonathan drove Annie to class. He wore sneakers and carried a backpack that looked, by intent, like any other parent's. At the school gate, he released her hand without dramatics. He had asked beforehand that no photos be taken and that teachers reinforce the privacy plan. Annie glanced back once and he waved, smiling in a way that meant, "I am here." Those in the schoolyard who knew the story kept their distance as requested. The gesture was small. He had shown up. That was, in the truest sense, the point. In the months that followed, tiny rituals accumulated into a texture of family life. Saturdays were for pancakes or for a library visit where Annie picked out a book by its cover and Jonathan learned to read aloud with appropriate enthusiasm for the adjectives. Annette taught him that asking for help is not weakness. Jonathan learned how to change a light bulb properly without making it a lesson. They held each other accountable in small ways, Annette reminding him of a dentist appointment, Jonathan bringing extra snacks when needed. The necklace clasp, repaired and polished, sat visible on Annie's neck as a modest testament to a truth that had once been hidden. There were days of doubt and anger, moments when past choices burned like small brandings. They dealt with them the way any family learns to manage pain, with honesty, with apologies, sometimes with silence, sometimes with humor. They celebrated banal victories, the first time they all fit on one couch for a movie, the day Annie drew a picture of 3 people by a tree and annotated it, simply, us. Those cartoons, those stick-figure affirmations, mattered more than any public accolade. Jonathan never stopped attending to the institutional implications of what had happened. He worked with the foundation to create an internal ombuds program, a confidential reporting channel for minors or vulnerable people, and clearer language about settlements that involved families. He accepted board-mandated external audits and pledged personal funds to a community program that supported families in precarious housing. He wanted his mistakes to seed systems that prevented similar erasures for others. Those reforms were slow, and not everyone praised them. He did not expect them to be perfect. They were an effort. On a quiet evening toward the end of their first full year together, Jonathan sat on a worn porch chair. The air was cool and smelled faintly of cut grass. His phone buzzed occasionally with logistics, a school note, a plumber's invoice, a reminder to pick up artwork. He kept a cup of tea that had gone cold and a small stack of photographs, papers and images that now functioned as an honest archive. He wrote a note to Annie, not long, a list of small promises, to be there for birthdays, to fix the broken kite, to read stories, even when tired. He folded the paper and put it into the envelope that also contained the small repair tag from the necklace. He walked quietly across the yard to the little gate, where Annie sometimes left shells she'd found near a stream. He opened the gate and saw her sleeping fitfully on the sofa through the living room window, one small arm thrown over her face. Annette sat nearby knitting something plain. The sight made his breath catch and then rearranged itself into something like gratitude. He thought of the months of depositions and mediation, of the court's precise language and the letter that said simply, presence over protection. He understood how inadequate words were compared to daily fidelity, and yet he understood the need to say them aloud and mean them. The repaired necklace glinted in the dim light on the coffee table, a small, stubborn sign of continuity. Jonathan took it up, feeling the cold metal bite the pad of his thumb. He threaded it onto his finger and then into a little velvet pouch he had bought earlier that week. He placed the note inside as well and left the pouch where Annette would find it. Small evidence not of performance, but of continuity. That night, he wrote a letter he kept in a drawer labeled not for public consumption, but for his own conscience. He did not intend it to be read by anyone but his future self. "I will be here," he wrote, echoing the terse note that had once mended a clasp. He added practical instructions, names of contacts, commitments to the foundation reforms, but the line that mattered most to him was the simplest. Presence is the work. Years would pass. There would be more hearings as the child grew and the family navigated adolescence. There would be new tensions. Parenting is a long apprenticeship, filled with mistakes and reparations. But the pattern was set. Presence, accountability, and small acts of care. The public's interest would ebb and flow, and the foundation would endure in its reformed shape. The real measure, however, would be in the days no camera saw, a father reading a bedtime story badly and then better the next night. A mother sleeping more easily, knowing her child's basic needs had been met. A child who had once been made invisible, now able to say, with small teeth showing that she had been seen. On a particular evening, much like the others but lighter, Annie slipped the necklace around Jonathan's wrist as if it were a bracelet, complaining that men did not wear jewelry often enough. He laughed and allowed it, feeling the small chain nick against his skin. She declared him officially acceptable. He took the small honor with a humility that surprised him. The last scene of their long beginning was not cinematic. It took place in the kitchen, where steam fogged the window and the radio hummed quietly. Annie drew with a marker, a line of concentric circles that could be anything from a sun to a top. Jonathan made grilled cheese and burned the first one, an error that produced laughter and then a better sandwich. They sat at the table, not posing, not appreciatively photographed, simply three people eating together. There was a clumsy grace to the moment. Annette cutting Annie's sandwich into stars, Jonathan pouring juice, Annie offering a piece despite knowing she would get a larger portion. Later, as Annie slept, Jonathan stepped onto the porch with the same notebook he had used to list commitments. He watched the night settle and felt, at last, a certain kind of peace that was not triumph, but a resolve to continue. He wrote one final line into the notebook that was less a slogan than a vow. Justice is not spectacle, it is presence. If this story moved you, if the journey from concealment to accountability and the bravery of a small voice felt important, please subscribe for more stories about truth, courage, and the steady work of repair.